Very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Steffen Kühne. I'm working with the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation. I'm very glad to see all of you here. And I also say hello to everyone who's watching this on the live stream or on YouTube later on. We are very happy to have you here for this book presentation. You will have heard that we have Kohei Saito here. He has written a new book. Many of you will have the possibility to buy it here. Otherwise, you can get it with... sorry, I'm just checking. I have the wrong notes, but that's what happens normally. The book we're talking about today is one on degrowth and the Anthropocene. It's about communism, it's about eco, it's about everything that we and Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation are excited about. We are very glad that Kohei is here. He's a friend of our institution for quite a while, and we are so glad that together with the Schwarze Risse Buchladen, we can make this evening possible. We have a facilitation here. It's Malene Gürgen from the Taz. She will ask questions for around about 1 hour. So all of you who will have questions, please note them down. There will be the possibility to ask them later on. If you're watching us on live stream, please take notes and you can send them via chat. I now say thanks again to everyone making this possible, especially to the facilitators. If the facilitators have problems, they will give us signs, right? And we say very warm welcome to the capital in the Anthropocene towards the idea of degrowth communism. I wish all of us a very great evening. Thanks for being here and joining us.
"2023 is likely to be the hottest year on record. This summer we have seen heat waves, we have seen oceans warmer than ever before. Wildfires out of control, tornadoes and extreme rainfall have caused deaths all over the world. That we have a huge problem is undeniable in the light of such events. The question is, what can we do about it? And here the answers differ greatly. From the tech optimists who bet on solutions that have yet to be invented, to the supporters of so-called green capitalism, who want us to believe that we can simply continue our lifestyle, to those who claim that the battle against the climate crisis is already lost, and all we can still do is to prepare ourselves for its deadly consequences. In 2020, a book was published in Japan that aims to provide an answer to these questions. It argues for a Marxist-based critique of growth and explains why we need degrowth communism and what that could look like. A few weeks ago, this book we are talking about was published in German under the title Systemsturz, der Sieg der Natur über den Kapitalismus. On this occasion, the author, Kohei Saito, is with us today. Kohei Saito is a philosopher and associate professor at the University of Tokyo. He has completed his dissertation at the Humboldt University here in Berlin, and he was also a co-editor of the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe. Mr. Saito, I'm very pleased to welcome you here at Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I'm really happy to come back here, and it's a little awkward to speak in English because even though I got my PhD in Germany, but yes, during the pandemic I also kind of lost my German skills, so please forgive me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion tonight.
I mean, we talked before, and I think your German is actually excellent, but your English is as well, so that's fine. So today, Kohei Saito will explain his idea to us and put them up for discussion, and we can debate together what we can take away from them. For the climate movement, for reading Marx, for the question of what kind of transformation do we actually need and how we can achieve it. So I also welcome all of you here. I'm also very happy that you came here today. My name is Malene Gürgen. I'm a journalist at the Taz, and I'd rather say straight away, I might have read Marx, but only a bit, and that's many years ago. So if there are people among you who are not Marx experts, don't worry. I'm not one either, and I'm moderating this event. So we will first talk here on the podium for roughly an hour, maybe a little bit less, and then there will be enough time for your questions from the audience. And after this, there will also be drinks and snacks, so if you want to, you can stay and continue the discussion over a drink. Okay, so Mr. Saito, before we talk about your book, I would like to start with your background. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself. What were your connections to the degrowth movements on the one hand and to Marxism on the other hand, and how did you come to this idea of degrowth communism?
Okay, so I mean, again, I'm Kohei Saito. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very impressed as there's so many people coming to this event. And the people asking me, like, are you Japanese celebrity and so on? And it's true that there's a documentary camera backstage from Japan to actually film my trip in Europe this time. But they're also filming the 6 months of my life to broadcast it on TV. So it's something very weird is happening. The Marxists on TV and the news and the radio, and then I'm talking about degrowth communism. And this is actually the Japanese version. It reached 500,000 copies, and this is just unbelievable number. But there are reasons that which we will discuss later. But I was not degrowth kind of people from the beginning. Let me briefly tell you about my life. I entered the University of Tokyo 2005. That was a time I started reading Marx because 2005, before the economic crisis, 2008 was also the time when there was also in Japan economic inequality and the worsening of the working conditions. So I started to reading the rather classical texts like Communist Manifesto and that kind of things in order to understand today's crisis of capitalism. But then I wanted to study more seriously, so I went to the US, but then US was non-Marxist, non-socialist, so I was like really disappointed. And I decided one day, oh, I have to go to Germany because Marx is born in Germany, right? And then in 2010, I came to Freie Universität. And then I got so disappointed. There was like no Marxist professor. There are not many Marxist professors anymore. But happily, I worked with Andreas Arndt. And after that, I also got involved in people like Ingo Stützle reading Capital every Monday at the over there Franz Mehringplatz, and that was very interesting because there were a lot of actually interest and discussion going on outside universities, and this is something that I didn't see in Japan. Marxists are more academia centered. So actually I was very much influenced by discussing issues with you drinking maybe wine and so on. But then of course 2011 the Fukushima nuclear power disaster came, and then I was really shocked. Of course my relatives were living in northern part of Japan, and I was worried, and then realized how would Marxists would respond to that kind of question? Because I was also kind of more traditional, in a sense, optimistic about development of technologies and so on, but the nuclear power disaster really showed that this is not something sustainable. So then I started to question the relationship between human nature, technology, and that was a time when I also started to join in this group of Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe. That is a Japanese group, and I joined there first. And then also in the BBAB there, reading those notebooks. And I realized that Marx, especially after 60s, read many books on natural sciences. That was a time when I sort of try to rethink about this issue of technology, based on those notebooks, because Marx actually talks about how modern capitalist agriculture is robbing the soil of its nutrients, and the soil exhaustion was a problem, and the development of technology only reinforces that destructive tendency and so on. And that was my dissertation, Natur gegen Kapital. And then still, I was more or less optimistic about technology. And the project that I started was modified, however, because 2018, 2019, there are massive uprising of like Greta Thunberg, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, and I was exposed to their messages, and then I realized, okay, we need something more radical. It's not just simply investing in renewable energies and the more green technologies is not enough as long as this capitalist system of infinite accumulation and infinite growth remains. And so that was a time for me, it's a radical break, accepting. It was hard for me too to accept that kind of degrowth. I never said explicitly in my first book, for example, degrowth, only eco-socialism. But after those movements, I realized maybe degrowth is something that we have to take into more seriously. But then, how is it actually compatible with Marx again? And so I worked on notebooks again and so on. And this is one of the more popularized version of my work, reinterpreting late Marx radically in a different manner. Namely, he became a degrowth communist.
Thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, we see the result of this journey.
I see the skepticism.
As you mentioned, your book was an enormous success in Japan with over 500,000 copies sold. So yeah, what was going on there? Maybe you can explain us a little, because I was thinking, like, is eco-socialism thriving in Japan and we should all move there as soon as possible, or what's going on there?
But I see also that some revivals of eco-socialist ideas in Germany too, and I was rather influenced by those, as I said, movements emerging in Europe and America. But I started writing this book in 2019, and then soon the pandemic came. So I think this success has to do with the pandemic, because during the pandemic, two things occurred. One is the economic inequality became really apparent, especially the working conditions of essential workers was so bad in Japan as well, and because of austerity and the healthcare system was in crisis, the crisis of care and so on. So we had also this book popularity of bullshit jobs and that kind of critique of someone who is just making easy money, and while many actually poor, less earning money are doing more essential jobs and so on. And then my book came in and to criticize this is really the tendency of capitalism to marginalize the cares and the essential works and so on. So that's one reason. And the second reason is I think during the pandemic, it really, our life really slowed down. Because of lockdowns and other measures. And that created some space of reflection for the Japanese people. I mean, in Japan, people work so hard. It's not like Berlin. So they never have a chance to reflect on what they're doing. They just consume, work, and then consume. And this process simply depoliticized our life and our imagination. But this situation changed. People started to spend more time with family, or maybe they started reading newspapers. And then they questioned, why did I commune 2 hours every morning? Or why did I buy so many clothes? Why did I drink so many beer with the colleagues that I don't even like, and so on? And this really created some of the contradictions became more clear. And so I think the message of degrowing, a little bit slowing down and focusing on what is more necessary. Because capitalism is a system that invests in what is profitable, not what is necessary, right? So this rather created this kind of problem in the middle of the pandemic. So I demanded, we have to invest in what is necessary, but this is not something that capitalism is good at doing. So this kind of message became very popular. And then maybe final one more thing is, in Japan, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of UN, is very, very popular. And then I start my book with the SDGs is the opium of the masses. Like Marx says, religion is opium masses. So because just using PET bottle, recycling things, using my bottles and eco bags, don't change basically anything about this crisis, right? But people are simply satisfied, and every newspaper, TV are praising these SDGs like the best concept ever. And then I criticize, and this got really a lot of criticism, not attention, and it created a kind of the popularity at the beginning.
Sometimes criticism is also good for popularity, yeah. That's still interesting, I think, how people come from, I should rethink about drinking beer with my colleagues, to reading an explicitly Marxist argumentation, but it's nice. So in your book, you outline 4 possible alternatives for our future. So there is climate fascism, in which the super rich use all their power to defend their privileges. Then there is climate Maoism, in which a dictatorship implements climate protection measures from above. Then there is the worst option, barbarism, in which basically everybody is at war with everybody else. And then against these 3 options, you put degrowth communism as the only desirable way. So can you briefly characterize what is this alternative about?
Okay, so degrowth communism is a kind of political intervention. I think today we need to have an idea of post-capitalism. That was my project, and that was why I think we still have to read Marx. Marx doesn't give an answer about concrete visions of society, future society, but still he really allows us to imagine to something beyond capitalism. So I utilized the climate crisis as a kind of the intervention, the opportunity of political intervention to radicalize some of the content among various discussions of the left. The problem of the traditional communist or socialist labor movement is obviously they are still sometimes quite productivist. They are praising more technological progress, and they also focus more on social welfare and higher wage and that kind of issue more than climate issues. So this marginalization is obviously not good, because as the climate crisis deepens, we have less and less space for that kind of the more socialist movement either. Now, I think one of the things that we need to learn from degrowth people is that growth after a certain point is not desirable, neither environmentally sustainable. So today, especially in the countries like Global North, we already have reached to a point where the further growth doesn't necessarily make us happier, or it doesn't bring the new technology that really saves us from the climate crisis. So eco-socialism, the idea of eco-socialism, people like John Bellamy Foster, Michel Levy, those people discussed this eco-socialism for many years, and I was greatly inspired. But it's not enough today, because eco-socialism can be growth-driven. It can aim to grow more once capitalist model production is overcome. But the point of degrowth is, as I said, after a certain point, no matter what kind of model production you have, growth is no longer sustainable, because, as Marx says, the Stoffwechsel, the metabolism between humans and nature, are some process of trans-historical process of exchange of energy, resources, and those things. So this is a material process that you can simply overcome in socialism. We are always conditioned. And in that sense, we need to little bit specify the idea of eco-socialism, which I put forward and defended in Natur gegen Kapital. I realized I need to go one more step further. It's either eco-socialist degrowth or degrowth communism. And I use the term degrowth communism for some reason, maybe I may explain later. But also, my point is, we also need communism or socialism, some kind of society beyond capitalism. Because I'm aware that many people also in Germany, like Meyer Gepel or Ulrich Hellmann, Ulrike Hellman. They also talk about endless capitalism, and then they, excessive consumption and great inequalities, and etc., problematic. But then, in the end, their proposals are like a little bit more progressive tax and a little bit of slowing down of certain bad industries. But we can have private properties, we can have market, competition, price mechanism. So after all those critiques and talking about crisis of capitalism, basically capitalism remains. And then I wonder if that's really enough. Because what we are witnessing today is even after the discussions on Green New Deal, in Green Deal and all the kind of things, we haven't witnessed sufficient progress. So I think there's something fundamentally contradictory about capitalism and environment. So my idea is communism or socialism are very important today, and degrowth people or someone who criticizes the excessive kind of growth, they don't necessarily talk about socialism. So it's my political intervention. Degrowth side need to learn more from the socialist tradition because we need to plan more, we need to produce what is more necessary than what is profitable. So degrowth people have this learning process, but at the same time, socialists, communist side, the labor movement have to learn from the degrowth side about the criticism of productivism. So this idea of degrowth communism is first, this kind of a combination, the necessity of both sides, environmentalism and the labor movement need to learn each other. And then they need to make an alliance, and only then it is today possible to really fundamentally challenge the fossil capital and other forms of domination and injustice under capitalism.
Okay, thank you. So I think we got an idea now what is the difference between your degrowth approach and liberal degrowth ideas, I would say. And this is precisely that you speak about capitalism as the core of it, and others don't. So maybe we can now talk a bit more about how degrowth communism relates to classical Marxist argumentation, because many Marxists would argue that according to Marx, communism and the liberation of the working class can only be achieved through an increase in productive forces, and then every degrowth approach would stand in contradiction to the interests of the working class. But you argue that Marx, especially in his late work, I think, came to a different conclusion or had a different view. And yeah, maybe you can elaborate a bit on that.
Okay. I simplify a little bit for the clarity. But basically, I define capitalism as a society where the logic of capital is most dominant thing. That is why we have capitalism. And what is capital? Capital is a constant movement of Geld, Ware, Geld. This general formula of constant increase of value. So capitalism is fundamentally defined by the constant economic growth. That's the system. But the problem is our interaction, which Marx calls metabolism, is something that is independent of capital. They exist for many years. Even before capitalism, we always had this kind of Stoffwechsel mit Natur. The problem is this process cannot be so easily modified. But capital increases its productivity with new technology, and they try to accelerate the circuit of capital so that they can invest and more, and the profit will be increased. The problem is when this process of acceleration or expansion of capital reaches a certain point, it creates the conflict or tension with the universal metabolism of nature. And that is where the metabolic rift, the kind of disruption occurs between metabolism of society and the metabolism of nature. And this is what Marx actually criticizes in the volume 3 of Capital. The problem is still, even despite this kind of criticism, I think this is a basic of ecological critique for Marxists. And then the problem is still many traditional Marxists had this kind of view of historical materialism, which is the mode of capitalist production consists of forces of production and the relations of production. And in a similar way, the productive forces reach a certain point it creates some kind of tension, and it explores the mode of capitalist mode of production, and then it reaches to next mode of production. So this kind of argument, of course, it's very simplified, but this kind of argument is often implicit in various forms of historical materialism. And this becomes a very easily productivist. Okay, so what we need first, productive forces, and then there will be a contradiction with the relations of production and so on. That was also the view, more or less, Marx put forward, especially in his writing about India, for example, British colonialism. And he basically saw that bringing this kind of technological development in other kind of societies is also necessary, but also the more increase of technology to productive forces necessary for Western countries and so on. But I don't think this is acceptable today, because also Marx started to correct this view. Why? Because, as I said, capitalism develops technology, increase productive forces, but only for the sake of making more profit, exploiting more from workers, or taking out, extracting resources and energies from nature. So these are the technologies that actually oppress workers, take away the freedom and autonomy of workers. These are the technology that actually creates various kinds of environmental destruction. So how would it be possible to use this kind of development of productive forces in order to emancipate workers and to fix the metabolic rift? Rather, precisely this development of technology is creating this metabolic rift, and it is also undermining the working condition of workers. So all these kind of things happens. He started reading Justus von Liebig, and this was, I argue in my book, that was a moment when he started to question this kind of optimistic assumption. And what happens afterwards? He was in a sort of personal crisis because he was defending this historical materialism for many, many years. But then this becomes incompatible with his ecological critique of capitalism. So what happens is, after publication of volume 1, after 1868, he started to reading more and more of natural sciences. And if you read these notebooks that are now available in the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, they contain a lot of ecological insights about deforestation, exhaustion of soil, coal, and also extinction of species, and that kind of issues are already there. And he was paying attention how the development of capitalism and technologies create that kind of problems. Interestingly, this is one of the arguments in my book, he also studied pre-capitalist and non-Western societies at the same time with natural sciences. That was very weird, because he was actually supposed to complete volume 2 and 3 of Capital. Engels was pushing, asking, when do you finish it? But then he's reading books on natural science, and then pre-capitalist society, and communes in Russia, India, and then so on and so on. Why? I think here again, the theory of metabolism is very important, because Marx was studying different ways of organizing metabolic interaction between humans and nature in other societies, other ways. And these are existent at the time in Russia, in Asia, in Latin America. So he was reading about them. But it was existing already in the past too, right? So he was reading about Germanic communities and other kinds of communities too. And then he realizes these societies are actually quite persistent. That expression comes from Morgan. But the persistent means very stable, it doesn't change. But it also means, in a different way, sustainable. It reproduces its basic conditions. So it doesn't increase productive forces, but everyone is kind of equal. And then the society itself is persistent, so meaning sustainable. So he realizes in other societies, this problem of equality and sustainability under the persistency of the society, this is related to each other. The problem of equality and sustainability is related. That is why he was so excited about Russian communes. And then in his very last stage of his life, the Russian revolutionary Vera Zasulich asks the question, capitalism is coming to Russia, would it be necessary for Russian communes to get destroyed by the power of capital? And then comes the socialist revolution. And then Marx says, no, what I talked about only applies to the Western societies. But then he continues. Even the Western societies are now facing the crisis of capitalism. And then the solution for this crisis is to return to a higher form of archaic commune. And he says, now returning to commune life, but and of course in higher form. Why? Because he was realized that kind of the equality and sustainability are closely related, and that these kind of conditions were satisfied under those communes. So he learned, he was inspired. So he even says Western society needs to learn from those communes, and they have to internalize some of the principles. What is the principle? Social equality, as I said, communality, and then sustainability under the persistency of the economic system, which is basically steady state. This is why those communes have been there for many, many years, hundreds, but thousands of years. Marx despised this in the 50s. This invariability of these communes must be destroyed by British imperialism and so on. But in the 80s, he changed his evaluation completely. And I think he sort of accepted, he corrected his productivism, he corrected his Eurocentrism, and then he abandoned this earlier form of historical materialism. Everything sort of changed. And then I think he became more open to the idea of steady state economy for the sake of establishing communism, which I call degrowth communism.
Thank you also for simplifying so much. So can we talk a bit more about this steady, stable, sustainable economy, about degrowth communism? Maybe to break it down even more, which concrete improvements could degrowth communism bring for the working class?
Okay, because, so although I'm a Marxiologist from the background, academic background, you know, Marx never uses the term degrowth, right? So when I say degrowth communism is something compatible with Marx, this is a kind of political intervention, as I said in the very beginning. It's very important to learn for the contemporary Marxists, or I think the contemporary left in general, to learn from degrowth side and also talk about, you know, other issues like decoloniality, feminism, and so on. But for my book, the degrowth communism is one of the central topics. And people often, even the left-wing people say, no, that's austerity, that's ecological dictatorship, we become poor because we try to, you know, go back to nature kind of things. No, that's a misunderstanding. So let me explain what degrowth is. Degrowth is a project to abandon GDP as a measure of progress or prosperity. Because GDP doesn't measure social inequality, degrowth doesn't measure cleanness of the air, degrowth doesn't measure many, many things. So I think we need to have a more comprehensive measure that also includes well-being, sustainability, and so on and so on. That's first topic. And then degrowth doesn't demand, secondly, doesn't demand.
But this is the same as liberal degrowth thinkers would argue,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And this, this is
Oh,
not
yes.
different from, yeah.
But then here comes this thing. So degrowth is about not scaling down everything. We scale down basically what is unnecessary. But unnecessary means very different meaning for different people. But I would include advertisements, excessive, fast fashion, private jets, cruise ships, and all these kind of things could be much more fundamentally challenged. We should demand abolishment of those kind of excessive consumption, especially among the rich. Here comes the more socialist politics. And first, so we intervene. We can even like ask them to ban those things, industrial meat and so on and so on. We have very different logic of accumulation afterwards. And then the second step is because the entire pie of the economy is no longer growing, or we don't seek after this expansion anymore. as a primary goal. It is much more necessary to consciously share the existing wealth with other people. And here comes a very interesting idea of Marx. Marx says there is this abundance of genossenschaftlicher Reichtum, the commonwealth. He says in the future communist society, this flow, all the springs of genossenschaftlicher Reichtum will flow abundantly in the future society. Why? It's not because we can produce so much. This is often misunderstood as if Marx is demanding something like private jets for everyone. This is not a socialist politics that we can defend today. It is rather, he's saying, this kind of commonwealth can be abundant. Which means, in today's society, everything is commodified. We have to pay for those commodities, no matter how important, essential they are for our lives. So if you don't have money, basically you are just excluded from the consumption of essential goods. But against this logic of commodification, we can introduce the logic of commonification. We introduce the commonwealth. More public transportation, more universal medical care, more public housing, and more free internet, everyone. That kind of things that are necessary, but they are artificially being scarce in capitalism because they are commodified. But we can sort of make it the common goods that everyone can have access to. So this is a new form of abundance that Marx is talking about in his Critique of Gotha program. And I think this vision of abundance is something I think we socialists can relatively easily accept, because public transportation, free education, free medical care, of course these things are more introduced in Germany compared to Japan or the US, but I think we can demand more of these things. And with these kind of reforms, so many people maybe in this room criticize me for not explicitly talking about revolution in my book. It's more like a reform, but it's more like a revolutionäre Realpolitik or radikaler Reformismus, as Joachim Hirsch says. It's a kind of the intervention within capitalism. We have free public transportation, but it's still capitalism. But after many, many things become commons, I think that society and our behavior and consciousness and desire will fundamentally change, because we don't have to worry about satisfying our basic needs anymore. We don't have to always compete for jobs because we can have something basic. So these are the things that I think we challenge some of the private property, and we don't leave what is essential to the market and price. We make the more common goods. So these are the things that are more or less missing in the liberal kind of the degrowth or steady state discussion. I think it is the socialist tradition that can contribute much more. But just we have to first abandon this skepticism about the term degrowth as a kind of form of austerity. People said that, especially in the US today. But I think we can imagine a new form of abundant society after overcoming the artificial scarcity of the commodification through commonification.
Thank you. I think you also talk about reduction of working hours as one of the benefits. Maybe you can explain that.
That's also something that the workers' movement and the degrowth movement can unite and fight together, because we are in the world where many things are commodified. So we need money, so we have to work even extra hours, especially the wage is low and stagnant and the job is precarious. So we have to compete more with others. This is just creating the disaster for many people. And I think the socialists need to criticize this kind of situation. We have been doing this. But that doesn't simply mean we have higher wages, because even if we have higher wages, what if we start consuming the money for buying more fast fashions and eating more beef, and this is not something I think the environmentalism cannot really find well. So I think the improvement of the working condition need to be looked for somewhere else, and I think one of the very common ground is reducing the work hours. We introduce more of the commodification, commonwealth, decommodify many things, and we also work less. Like we can start, especially already in Europe, there are a lot of experiments about 4 working day kind of thing, but we could maybe try 3 working day and something like that. By reducing the number of hours, we will also slowing down the growth, but we are also decreasing the production of unnecessary goods, and we are also improving the welfare of working class because of this competition, the long work hours and so on. This is not good because workers have to take care of their babies, and these are the things that can be more or better satisfied under socialist regime with degrowth kind of politics. So, once we stop producing, once we sort of starting giving up some of the excess things, not everything. I'm pro-investing. I'm arguing for investing in more of renewable energies. I am arguing for investing more in electric vehicles. We need them, but at the same time, we cannot have infinite numbers. Now, we also have to think about reducing the total number of cars, of course, but we need a new technology. So I'm not anti-technologist, but I think, so again, coming back to the point, I think the shortening working hours is good for the environment, good for the well-being, so good for the workers, and they can spend more time for politics, learning new things, spending time with family, kids, friends, and doing sports, and I don't know. I mean, so these are the things that are really good. Once we sort of redefine the idea of affluence, prosperity, away from the consumptionist lifestyle.
Okay, so you just spoke about technological innovations, and I mean there are also eco-socialist currents who rely heavily on technical solutions, who say, for example, that once we have cheap unlimited energy because we have built solar and wind energy properly, we can have socialist growth unlimited. So it already sounded like you're criticizing these approaches, but how exactly?
So I think one more thing about the socialist tradition is the international solidarity. It's very important for me too, and I think we could, so the countries like Germany and Japan could invest more and more in electric vehicles and renewable energies, and maybe we could reduce the emission to some extent. But the problem is it will not be fast enough. It will never reach the decarbonization by 2050, for example, because we have the production of bigger cars, more model changes, and these kind of excessive advertisement, they compel us to produce and consume more and more. So as long as I think this tendency continue, will be not successful. But I think this is a basic promise of Green Deal politics in the European Parliament, but also the Green New Deal among some of the left wing. One thing we have to make it clear is, as I said, we need, of course, electric vehicles, but the number should be reduced. So this is degrowth. We need to share the cars, and we also need to use more bicycles. Bicycle is a great technology, and we need to invest more in public transportation. So these things create jobs, and I think in these terms, of course, there are some way of collaborating, labor movement and environmental movement, and so on. But I think it is very important to emphasize. So one more thing is, if we try to grow with these green technologies, these technologies are also produced using metals, energies, and so on. So the extraction of the rare metals from Africa, Latin America, will be much more excessive. It's already happening in lithium production and so on. So it is also one of the responsibility for the global north. So it's just basic thesis of the environmental justice. For the global north, it is more responsible to reduce our consumption, just correcting the kind of imperial Lebensweise for the sake of making some room for the development of the global south. I think the global south, of course, needs more development for satisfying their basic needs.
Which means growth also.
Yes, which means growth, basically. So they use more energies, and they use more resources. They also need them. But do we need more sports cars? Probably not. So I think this way of challenging the excessive consumption, and we need to, I mean, these kind of demands are already there, especially in Europe. The context is very different in Japan. People are more conservative. And so I think my friend said, I mean, your book is radical in Japan, but your book will be majority in Germany. That's what Marx Gabriel said. But
I'm not so sure about that, but we'll see.
But so I mean, there are many attempts already, and I think this optimism of technology must be also corrected. Also, Marx didn't say that we should not use technology. He said when he said we need a higher form, it means that we use those technologies that have been developed under capitalism. So it's not about going back to nature, but that doesn't mean we can infinitely grow. So we just simply need to this distinction, and then the degrowth is not saying something very weird to us. It's something that we can relatively easily accept once we understand what they're saying without bias. I also had a bias for many years, but I think I hope that this will be some kind of the mediation for the traditional left wing to the environmental movement and degrowth movement.
Okay, so I have to say, like, I find your arguments very convincing, and what you say about degrowth communism, you're welcome. But at the same time, I wonder how we can actually achieve this, because sometimes I feel like it's so hard already to convince people of green capitalism instead of just capitalism. For example, I mean, you talked about transport, and in Germany there are so many people defending the combustion engine and don't see the electrical car as an alternative. And we all know that the electric car actually isn't an ecological alternative, and you described this very well in your book. But then I wonder if it's so hard to convince people to just switch the engine of their car, how can we convince them of these much more radical changes that you are proposing? Because I think in the end it's not only about private jets, right? It would be nice if that's the case, but I think it isn't.
Yeah. So I was also thinking about this issue recently, because we had many environmental movement uprising in 2018, 19. Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, and those things, and it continued a couple years, but it didn't really transform the system. The system of fossil capital is so strong. So I mean, the concrete strategy of bringing this kind of revolutionary subjectivity is something that we still have to look for. But I think the precondition for that is the unity or alliance of working class movement and degrowth environmentalist movement. But this is not emerging yet, even in Germany. So one proposal for me is first, make the idea of degrowth communism clear. Without some kind of idea, we cannot even try to achieve the goal. So I try to set some goal. How to achieve this goal, it's still hard. But I think one of the point, after reading this book, it is okay to criticize more explicitly capitalism. You know, it's weird, you know, people know that the capitalism is in crisis, but we cannot say the word socialism or communism, especially like countries like Japan. People think that you are stupid. But they, it's because they don't have this idea. Once we have idea, we could question what would be a way to achieve this, or what would be a way to get closer to this goal. And I think that is why I often talk about concrete reformist policies. And my book talks about a lot about Barcelona, Ada Colau, and she, of course, doesn't talk about communism. But Barcelona en commun, so the Barcelona in common, this is a kind of the attempt to challenge some of the global capitalism and the EU, and then they try to get more of the autonomy and the participation and the equity for everyone in a sustainable way. And some of the measures that they introduced, but also there are other projects, reducing the car lane and then transforming it into the bike lane, and the kind of things are very slow. We need to have more of them in a more massive manner, but at the same time they will create some of the conditions for changing our behavior and consciousness, as I said, desire, from the consumptionist way, the bigger car is good, it's more convenient, to something that, okay, we need to have more equal transportation, and so on. And also reducing the working hours and that kind of things happening within capitalism today. But I think over the long run, we could utilize the socialists, environmentalists could utilize these ideas that are already accepted, many people in Europe especially. We could utilize them to have more radical reformation in the end. So it's a kind of a gradual transformation with a radical aim. So this is a radical reformism. I think this is one of the strategies, especially like countries like Japan. It's very important to have this reformist strategy because we don't have, unfortunately, a big movement. Even Fridays for Future is regarded as something very dangerous or something. So in a conservative society, we need to have this kind of the concrete ideas within capitalism with the aim of overcoming itself.
Okay, so maybe one last question from me about this, and then we can open to the audience. So concerning this question about how to bring forward this this radical change, in your book you also mentioned a study by the American political scientist Erica Chenoweth, who talks about, or which the study got famous as the 3.5% rule. Maybe you can explain this and why you're making this reference.
Okay, I mean, this idea has been, for example, criticized by my friend Andreas Malm, and it's a little bit unpopular among the left-wing people. I also understand the reason, but at the same time, I think I wanted to end this book with some kind of positive messages in the readers in Japan who don't have genossen and genossinnen around them. They are interested in ecological crisis. They are worried about ecological crisis. They want to do something, but other friends are apolitical. It's hard to talk about politics and climate change with friends. These are the situation in Japan. So we need to have some cultural understanding, the toleration of more, making the tone a little bit too mild. But I think this message of 3.5 thing is like, if very small number of people stand up, they could actually bring some fundamental change. And I think this is something we need. We need a kind of optimism of the will. And we can actually criticize that this is really actually the way of denouncing violence, and this is extreme center and that kind of thing. But
because the study is only about violent free protests,
yes,
right?
Yeah. Yes. So they try to denounce other forms of violent social movements and so on, so on. Okay, I understand, but in Japan, violent social movements do not exist either way. So, so I just a little bit of the positive message, and I think this is something. I mean, I guess the German people also may find attractive too. I mean, I think this rule could be a way forward, but concretely how? The strategy, the question of strategy, is something that I'm still in the middle of doing research. So I'm very much looking forward to your feedbacks and criticism so that I can learn more about strategies, new attempts, and how we really challenge this capitalist system based on fossil capital.
Yeah, thank you. I think this was a very good transition. I think this was a very good transition because I'm sure that there are also people here who are parts of movements and organizations who aim for such radical change. And so yeah, now it's time for your questions, and I think that there will probably a lot of questions, so I would ask you to really keep it short and to really ask questions and not give co-speeches if that is possible. Okay, I think there's a microphone somewhere and somebody comes around with it. Is that true? Yeah. Can you, I mean, you can decide on your own which ones you take. I think it's easier than if I do it from here.
Maybe we gather a couple of questions.
Yes, I just have to briefly look into this because there are also some questions from the people who are watching the live stream, and but there's already somebody there, right? Okay, yeah.
Saito-san, どうぞよろしくお願いします。Thank you for your radical pedagogy that you are doing with releasing this book, and also the other more theoretical one, Marx in the Anthropocene, which if you haven't read it, please go buy it. It's outside. Schwarzrisse. Sorry. I'm an anthropology student, and in anthropology, I don't want to, ich will kein Choreograf halten. I'm going to keep it short. There's this tendency of more than human anthropology, which you also cite in your book, Marx in the Anthropocene, with Anna Zing-Lovenhaupt, for instance. And there's a newer turn with, like, more recently with Sophie Chow, which I think is actually deviating in a more reactionary direction towards what I would say is a more Hegelian idealist direction, which is moving away from Anna Tsing's attempt with her book Friction, for example, to give a more materialist, internationalist, anti-imperialist view. Okay, I'm keeping it very short. I'm almost finished, sorry.
Maybe what's your question?
My question is, I think what you argue, yeah, is that the late Marx, with his turn towards a more materialist dialectics, which is not only concerned about the superstructure, but is concerned with what you say, communalism, councils, public utilities, which you described with Laclau and this other framework, which I would criticize, but I'm not going to keep you for too long. So I think this is what we desperately need. I'm a neighborhood activist. I'm a disabled activist. And as an anthropology student, I would also reach out to everyone in the audience tonight, as well as you, Saito-san. Please go out into the field and do the work. We cannot only rely on reforms. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. From now on, questions, please.
No, my question would be, what is, Saito-san, what is your view on this?
Okay. There was somebody here very early. I think we can take another question. I think we can take a couple questions and then you answer them, okay? Yeah.
Frida?
Yeah, maybe this one and then this one and then you, yeah. Okay?
Auf Deutsch.
Deutsch geht auch.
Hallo, allerseits. Eine kurze Frage. Du hast darüber gesprochen, dass im Kapitalismus, also in unserer Gesellschaft, der Maßstab der Produktion nicht das ist, was nötig ist oder was vernünftig ist, sondern der Profit, ne? Jetzt wundere ich mich ein bisschen darüber, über deine Ausführungen bezüglich der radikalen Kritik oder dem, was wir machen sollten, weil in allem, was du vorschlägst, also zum Beispiel sowas wie andere Formen der Fortbewegung etc., unterscheidest du dich eigentlich nicht sehr von den Leuten, über die du vorher gesprochen hast, nämlich die gesagt haben, Bio einkaufen, das wäre doch die Lösung. Die Frage an dich, mich wundert es ein bisschen, weil du hast gesagt, in dieser Gesellschaft ist der Maßstab der Profit und das ist der Grund, weswegen die Natur so aussieht, wie sie jetzt aussieht, nämlich erstmal ziemlich vernutzt. Jetzt ist die Frage an dich, was ist denn mit der politischen Macht, die diese Gesellschaft erstmal einrichtet, unterhält und die Maßstäbe, also zum Beispiel Profit machen, Privateigentum, durchsetzt. Weil wenn du sagst, man muss einfach quasi Vorschläge machen, dann tust du ja so, als würden die Entscheidungen in dieser Gesellschaft treffen, einfach nicht gewusst haben, dass ihr politisches System und ihr ökonomisches System die Natur kaputt macht und den Menschen vernutzt. Das heißt, an genau dem Punkt frage ich dich, wie haben wir es denn mit dieser Macht, mit dieser politischen Macht, also dem Staat, der das Privateigentum, also die Grundlagen für diese Gesellschaft durchsetzt?
Okay.
Stellen wir uns
Danke.
daneben und sagen,
Yeah,
wollen wir den Entscheidungsträgern einfach ein paar
Okay, so it's a
Vorschläge
question of power. I think you got everything right. Yeah. Okay. So then one more question here, and then we have a break for answering.
Ja, ist das klar? Kann ich verstanden werden? Okay. My question concerns the very term capitalism. I think it's a simplification and it's a dangerous one. Because in reality, Marx and Engels have been talking about the domination of the capitalist mode of production over modern bourgeois societies. So we have two terms, the capitalist mode of production and modern bourgeois societies. And I think it's important, and you mentioned it already here, that we have other dimensions of structural crisis. Gender dimension, the north-south dimension, the ecological dimension, which is central to your book, and how does this fit with taking up this uncritical use of the term capitalism?
Okay, so I think that's enough questions for the first round.
So in terms of power, yes, I get a lot of response also from my Japanese readers that I don't discuss the state power, and this is true. But it follows from my reading of Marx. I don't talk also much about class struggle in my work, because for me, so this is kind of related to what Frida just pointed out. For me, for my reading, the logic of the commodity, the logic of money, the logic of capital, these are impersonal powers. They are not necessarily, it's not like a personified, it's just more like an impersonal one that we cannot say someone is oppressing us. It's more like the reified, this relationship of things that dominates us. And for Marx, for this reading of Marx, it is very important to limit the power of commodity and money. So that's why I talk often about decommodification and commonification. These are the things that try to restrict these impersonal powers so that we have more rooms for other activities that is not capitalist centered, that is not consumptionist and so on. But I also understand that after a certain point, of course Marx had the plan to write about the state. So I have to I have to talk more about the state power and so on. But yes, this is something that I have not elaborated in my book, and it's also very hard how to, we can't imagine at least immediate dismantling of the state power or anything like that. So this is the necessity, because the state massively subsidized the fossil fuels, and so these are the state power in really concretized in the fixed capital. But I think this is yes, something that I have to think more, and thank you for pointing that dimension out.
There are so many people here having questions, okay? We had this other question of Frida. Sorry, but we're not going to have a one-on-one discussion here. People don't understand you.
It's actually something which was pointed out to me a lot. I'm the translator of the books. The title is Systemsturz.
there is a lot of discussion going on, is chosen by the publishing house, is not chosen by Kohei Saito, it's not chosen by me. So this criticism, if you have for something, please to the publishing house, but not to Kohei or something, because just to point it out, that's a criticism which has been on.
Okay, thank you for this clarification.
Well, I gave the permission, so I mean, you can criticize me too. It's fine.
Okay.
So
okay,
yes,
so
and
now
about the modern bourgeois society dimension is actually yes a little bit marginalized in my discussion. I focus a little bit the simplified version of this logic of capital accumulation too much. So maybe it creates some difficulty for connecting other problems in the modern bourgeois society, like patriarchy, racism, and ecological issues. But it is also exactly this attempt to bridge the gap in my work. This is why I talk about ecology, and I also wanted to talk more about kind of decoloniality and eco-feminism, that kind of things. But at the same time, I think there are various dimensions exactly that cannot be overcome by transcending capitalism somehow. There will be discrimination against some people. There will be inequality of gender, as long as, capitalism is not simply the cause of all the evils in our society. So in a sense, we need more of bridging these two problems. And yes, maybe I will think about other ways of integrating these aspects. Thank you for pointing out.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, maybe I can see the hands of everybody who has questions again, because I'm looking for women, and I see one. And I'll take that one, and then I think you, because that was early, and I have to take one of these questions as well. So yeah, apologies in advance if not everybody can talk today. But as I said, there's also time for discussion afterwards.
Yeah, hello. Very much, many thanks for your intervention. For years now, it's been important for the left and the ecologists, but I actually come with a feminist question, because I don't think it's another question than the ecological one. And I think it would be worth it to talk about it. So all these ideas, yeah, that we prioritize life, from consumption for market and profit, or that we prioritize metabolic circles of regeneration and reproduction. These, of course, are things that Marxist feminists have been talking about forever, right? And of course, as you said, again, the ecofeminists. And the ecofeminists, they center the extractivist capitalist logic that exploit nature and feminized as cheap labor. So for them, it's like the same logic. And we know that Marx had a little problem with thinking of reproduction as something that is actually exploited by capital as productive labor. So my first question is, did actually Marx, at the end of his life, get the question of reproduction right as well? So how does he talk about the communizing? Because, and this is my second question, in terms of today, what we see, especially, I don't call it Global South, in countries where actually Subsistenzwirtschaft, like Maria Mies and all these great people have called it, in these countries where subsistence economy, yes, it's my second question, I'm formulating it, is taking place. We see that the central role is that feminized women play the central role of reproducing communality. Because they reproduce life. It's not about taking babies, but it's about caring about stuff, and for no other reason. So, for me, to you, what do you think is the role of ecofeminist positions in this new eco-socialist frame that you're saying, and why is it not more central?
Thank you. Okay, then one over here. Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for your presentation. My question is about working hour reduction. So in your book you say basically degrowth communism will save the planet, which is a bit populist, but it saves a planet which is already fundamentally destroyed. And for that, we will need a lot of labor in the future. Let's say to take care about refugees, climate refugees. We need regenerative farming, so we need a lot of labor. How can you be sure that getting rid of bullshit and bad shit jobs is enough, like to deal with all these kinds of problems?
Okay, yeah. That was also a question. Also in face of demographic change, I can add. And then one more question here in the first row.
Ganz kurz, nur deine
Danke.
Frage, die du als zweite gestellt hast, was ist mit den politischen Perspektiven, Klimafaschismus, Kampf aller gegen alle? Also wie siehst du das? Also, weil es geht in die Richtung der Politik, auf die er hingewiesen hat. Und du hast darauf nicht geantwortet. Vielleicht hast du keine Antwort, aber es würde mich interessieren zu hören.
Okay, I think
thank you
these are
for
enough.
great questions. So I think, yes, one of the things that I should have emphasized a little bit or more is the role of reproductive labor in the ecofeminist tradition, like Maria Mies, Bellhoff, and Vandana Shiva, and all those people. And the problem when I was writing this book is I was really focusing on the ecological crisis, and of course, you said you cannot separate them, but at the same time, I wanted to sort of bring back the idea of communism. So that was just, my focus was on that, but now I also understand the importance of reproductive aspects, especially during the pandemic. The crisis of care was one of the central issues, and I could have more intervention if I wrote more about, I discussed this issue a little bit, but I should have integrated in order for the more effective political intervention. But the problem is, yes, Marx himself didn't pay enough attention for this issue even until the end of his life. But I think one understanding of theory of metabolism, Stoffwechsel, is very important, because then it not just includes this wage labor, kind of productive labor, but also this process of entire Stoffwechsel is about caring the land, caring the others. So things become much wider with this theory of metabolism. So actually I'm working on one of those projects that based on Marx's theory of metabolism, which hasn't been getting enough attention, in my view, in the last research, in the previous research by other people. Based on that theory of metabolism, I'm trying to integrate a more role of social reproductive labor into Marxian theory of labor and the value and so on. And I think that might create much more connection with the ecofeminist tradition, and especially ecofeminism. If you read these texts written in the 90s, they are basically pretty much demanding degrowth thing already. So, I'm not saying that this idea is something that Marx actually found for the first time, and this is me, first one who is pointing out. There are many ideas in the tradition of eco-socialism, in the tradition of ecofeminism, but I wanted, as a Marxologist, to integrate some of the aspects to intervene in this climate crisis and the political conjuncture. And for the question of, yes, reproducing, these new tasks that we have to do are quite labor intensive, yes. So we cannot so naively imagine that we will be emancipated from labor. Again, so we try to reduce bullshit and bad shit jobs and focus more on essential works. And these are often labor intensive. It's interesting because some automation ideas, automation socialists, are talking only about emancipation from labor. But in my book, I argued in another way. We cannot abandon labor, we cannot abolish labor in the future society. We need to make the labor more attractive. So it includes processes like more democratic participation, the unification of conception and execution, and also more rotation of the jobs. And these are things that I discuss in my book, not simply reducing, but also making the existing unabolishable remaining necessary essential labor more attractive. And I think that's one of the way of making compromise. And for the yes, ecological barbarism and ecological fascism, and these are the things that are really happening already in the European right-wing populists. So, you know, more climate refugees, and this will, especially in the past, the right-wing, like people like Trump used to deny the climate change, but now even the right-wing people cannot deny the existence of climate change. So they shift the tone. Le Pen and all those people now talk about climate change, but for the sake of protecting our lands, protecting our organic foods, and these are the things that can be very reactionary and conservative. But the problem is when we let this crisis happening more and more, the room of negotiation becomes much smaller. We are already witnessing the geopolitical tension over natural resources, and it will create much more food shortages and water shortages in the future because of the worsening of the weather conditions and the climate conditions. So I think this is really, today is almost, the next 10 years is really the important time for bringing or preparing kind of the international solidarische Lebensweise, if I use this expression from the Ulrich Brand. But I think so this is really the last moment. When the crisis happens, it would be too late. And I think the countries like Japan will be super fascist very easily. So I'm hoping that this imagination of emancipatory politics, of degrowth communism, create the room of discussion and create the room of political activity in the coming years, also in Germany. So I was very happy that this book gets translated into German.
Yeah, I think just to explain this briefly, also coming back to this question before, I think a feeling that many people have in Germany right now is we have seen these huge demonstrations of Fridays for Future. They had all the support and they were making their demands and they were saying how a different future should look like. And what happened is not that we got actual climate protection policies, we now got a rise of the extreme right-wing party, you know? So I think right now many people are really in this state of, or I think this is why the question about power and how do we actually achieve these things and what are the means of change, like in a concrete way, like how can we is it about convincing people? Is it about making referendums? Is it about, so I think this is why these questions are so prevalent in the discussion.
Yeah, so I think of course, you know, these movements emerged, but then they didn't really maybe concretize, institutionalize the new laws, and we don't see the radical changes, but it's been just 5 years. But I can feel that our perception of the climate crisis really changed in the last 5 years. At least my perception has really deepened compared to 2011, when I was more concerned about nuclear power plants and so on. So I think the perception has been changing, and this has been occurring on various trends, even outside the left. And this could, I think, be accelerated. And the philosophers could, I think, help a little bit, because I think philosophers work with concepts, and then we need to facilitate this modification or changing, transformation of our perception with new concepts of abundance, new concepts of degrowth, new concepts of communism, and these will bring up more ideas, new views of the world, and these will, I think, help more and more people. And I understand the
right.
hardships, but at the same time, we shouldn't be that pessimistic, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, so I read one of the questions from the online audience, and then I will take like maybe 2 more questions from the audience here. So somebody asked, speaking of international solidarity, how would the concept of degrowth translate to the larger and poorer part of the world, where degrowth may sound like only making things worse? Does degrowth need a complement in the way of regrowth and also actually talking openly about a necessity for an actual revolution, not just demand. So I think we very briefly touched on the subject of Global South and what growth means there, and how degrowth concepts translate into that, but maybe you can talk more about this. And then, yeah, some more questions. Maybe we can take two from the back now. I see somebody there in the middle and somebody there. Sorry, this is completely random now. I just have to pick. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's very encouraging to hear that it's popular, the common sense, and there's something very wrong in the way left and right are talked about often, because it's asymmetrical. It's basically common sense against the forces of evil and inertia and a lot of Cold War propaganda. So all the best for doing this work. And one specific question is that your suggestion to replace GDP with something else reminds me of Otto Neurath's notion of Lebenslage, which was presented in the 1930s in the framework of Wiener Kreis, and he was also part of the Bavarian attempt, which was quenched by the Prussian army then. And so in some ways it sounds like a reset, like there was a Siedlerbewegung, there were a lot of this common sense. It was a time when socialism sounded like just a very good common sense idea of how to organize things. And then the Nazis came, and then the Cold War came, and then US propaganda across the world made a lot of people scared of communism. So what do you think that the internet and the climate change could work together as huge forces that could help to make it happen differently this time?
Okay, so one more. Yeah, I think. Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Can you hear me? Thank you for your talk. My question concerns, because you also mentioned international solidarity, but it also kind of touches upon the question of political power, because I wonder how to deal with unequal developments in that transition, right? Because then I imagine you would have the problem of kind of over-accumulation of capital in capitalist states that kind of seeks for new investment strategies for land. So I wonder, like, where is the change happening? Is it like a global working class, a global movement? Yeah, maybe you can say something to that. Thank you.
Thank you for this short question. Thank you very much.
What was the second question?
Maybe you can start with this
I start
international
with the global south. And yes, again, we need to make it clear that the global south needs to grow. So, I mean, the growth is basically limited to the countries in global north. And I mean, that's as simple as this. I mean, but I think the question would be how to politicize degrowth. So I think we are, especially, I'm also reaching to the next task. So I presented the idea of degrowth communism. So it's an idea. So it's something that we sort of imagine. But how to make the transition? We need strategies. We need to tackle various political challenges. And this is, I just attended before coming to Berlin conference, degrowth conference in Zagreb. And there are a lot of discussions about degrowth, of course. But then these are the things that, oh, this and this must be done. This would be the ideal thing that we overcome, the unequal exchange and so on. But the problem is, of course, that this is ideal version of degrowth, and this would probably help people to live in a better condition. We don't get necessarily poor and so on. But it's only after we really achieve this, and making the transition requires the discussion, force, power, hegemony, and yes, I think this is then coming into the sphere of more of the politics, and yeah, these are the things that I also want to maybe discuss later with you, and how what kind of movements could make this alliance for degrowth communism. And the problem of the Otto Neurath, I also been reading his works because his Kriegswirtschaft, the economy of the war, is about planning, right? So he discusses the economy in kind. Basically, in the situation of war economy, we cannot count on market and price mechanism anymore because these are inefficient, and so we have to have a very different type of economic system based on conscious planning. And I think this is the question that we also need to ask today. The issue of planning. We have to plan what we can produce, what we cannot produce, what is necessary, and even if they are necessary, how much do we produce? And these are the questions of planning. And planning is the word that immediately reminds of socialism. That's why degrowth people often avoid talking about planning. But so socialists also have a lot of contribution for this discussion. So I believe that this tradition, socialism, so planning, state, and many things that Marxist and other left tradition has been discussing need to be ecofeminism, of course, included. It must be revived, and I think this is a very good time of intervention because the left has been declining everywhere in the last 30 years, but now the situation has been, as you said, it's really like 1920s almost. But then I think this is also the time of radicalization and opening of new discourses. So really, I mean, we have to come up with new ideas, and we shouldn't be afraid of talking about those content. And about unequal exchange, this always happens. So it's very, so it's again a problem how it's very difficult. But for example, my activity in Japan was about fast fashion. So there's a company called Uniqlo and Alexanderplatz, there's a Uniqlo Laden. And then this is a famous Japanese fast fashion companies. And they produce a lot of clothes in Bangladesh. Basically, they exploit the cheap labor there and then sell massively in Japan. And then now everywhere in the world. But the problem is people, of course, in Bangladesh don't have any working rights. They cannot form unions and they cannot demand anything to the first retaining company, the company of the Uniqlo. So me and my friends organizers try to organize the workers, Japanese workers in Uniqlo to address this issue of exploitation of the workers in Bangladesh. Then the Uniqlo has to, I mean, at least respond to this issue. I mean, it doesn't really change immediately. It's very hard because also the Japanese workers, Uniqlo workers are also low paid and so on. So I mean, but then this is also a kind of creating the room for international solidarity. And I think this is just a small example around me, but these are the maybe helpful to illustrate some of the things that I've been discussing.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for like one last question. I think there was one here. Yeah, because I think the microphone is probably close there. Okay. And then because also for the translators, it's getting exhausting. So we have to stop at some time. And also for you probably.
Awesome. This is going to be real fast. It's just 5 sentences, I swear. So what I particularly enjoyed about your work is the argument that to stop any political project at the stage of simple transference of ownership of productive forces from capitalists to the state would undermine the very attempt at democratization as the productive forces are made to rob the autonomy of workers, right? Your critique of productive forces. As you say in your work, removing the capitalists from the workplace doesn't mean the workers will suddenly be able to run it themselves. How do you imagine democratization and ecologization of productive forces to take place? And additionally, my friend, I have a question about the quality of your intervention and those of your Marxist and degrowth colleagues have had on the climate and labor movement in Japan. Your work presents a challenge to both as it highlights the potential of labor as that force that mediates the relationship between society and nature, albeit at capital's command, And I wonder to what extent you are aware or it is known that the climate movement may take up labor questions and the labor movement in Japan may take up climate questions. That's it, my guy. Thanks a lot.
I mean, in Japan, the labor movement doesn't almost exist, unfortunately. So it's very, very hard. And but I think this issue of the climate crisis would be a way of revitalizing the Japanese labor movement a little bit. So this is a political imagination. I think the environmentalism has reached a certain point. They realizing. I mean, I'm also part of it. So we are realizing we need some more system change or like kind of institutionalization. And this is where, as I repeated many times during this conversation, this is where the socialist ideas of planning, institutionalization, and so on can teach even the experiences. But they also have to learn, of course, and they have to reflect on the previous marginalization of problem ecology, but also other issues of, focusing simply on global north and, male-centered and so on. But I think this is really the new sphere of new struggle, and I'm not that pessimistic again. So this is really something different from that. I entered university 2005. I said in the beginning there was really no hope at the time, but I think it changed everywhere because the situation is even worse. But at the same time, this is something that I want to continue to explore. And about democratization, this is not easy task. So we cannot have the master principles, or we can have this. We can use this manual to democratize workplace. So it depends on the nature of work. So we cannot have the general idea. It's more like a practical issue. But what I wanted to point out is if we really care about democratization of workplace, I'm involved in Japan in the cooperative movement. Cooperatives are finally legalized in Japan 2 years ago. So this is really a new kind of possibility to have more of autonomy and freedom, the democratic decision process in the working place. And this tradition obviously exists many years in Europe. So, but that kind of things could not necessarily have to, but could slow down the production. So, but this is something that Marxists often avoided, or at least Marx himself didn't seem to explicitly discuss, especially when he was young. But by putting insights of degrowth and slowing down, we really have to think about these new issues. What's the balance? We cannot sacrifice productivity and efficiency because, as you pointed out, we are in the emergent state. We need efficiency, we need more investment. But at the same time, we have to slow down in other areas, we have to reduce and so on. So this issue is very complicated. But that's not something that someone from above can decide. It needs to be grounded on a more bottom-up democratic process. That's basically what I wanted to say for now.
And I mean, the good thing is for sure that at some places we can already see these democratic processes and approaches. Okay, I think we have now reached the end of our discussion here. I know that there are many more questions, but maybe there's a possibility to ask them later. And I want to say thank you to you, Kohei Saito, now for presenting your ideas and putting them up for discussion and critique here. And thank you to all of you for listening and being patient and asking your questions or keeping your questions for later. And a very special thank you to our translators, who I think did a very good job this evening. And as I said before, I think there will be drinks and snacks now. I think outside, upstairs at the terrace or something. Okay. And so yeah, if you want, you can stay, continue discussions, or you can go and enjoy the wonderful evening outside. I wish you a very pleasant evening in any case. Thank you.
Thank you.